Well, what I wanted to do this morning was to take a look at the questions that are on the back of the sheet number 4. I there put several statements that a skeptic might make if they were trying to disprove or at least discredit the resurrection of Christ. And what I want us to do this morning, and the reason I got the board out, is I want to just write down the points that we might make in opposition or to counter these contentions. So we start with probably the most extreme position, which is Jesus wasn't real. Jesus simply was not a real person. He is made up. He's just a mythology. He's no more real than Hercules or Paul Bunyan. How would we answer someone who has made this claim? And remember, the past week of lesson that we have been talking about was the historical evidence that we find in the Gospels, both by the nature of the Gospels themselves, but also by some of the external evidence. Writers who were not Christians, writers who were not biblical writers, who wrote about Christianity at the time. So keep that in mind. How would you first answer someone who makes the claim that Jesus wasn't even a real person?
Kind of answered your own question.
Well, go ahead, Samantha. How did I answer my own question?
Because you talked about the historical writers, you talked about those who wrote Scripture, who talked about it. Like Luke, for example, in the first chapter, talks about having gathered information from various people, but you also mentioned that people outside of the gospel writers also mentioned Jesus, and we did talk about that. So the fact that there were outside people who mentioned him and talked about him, it definitely is a good indication that he was actually real.
Right. So the extra biblical evidence for Christ, we talked about a week ago that I think it was at least 7 different Roman emperors had the name of Christ basically come across their desk from various governors and people who were writing at the time, historians from ancient Rome, and historians of the Jewish culture in Rome. There were historians like Josephus, who I believe Josephus was a Jewish historian. There were others we talked about who weren't Jewish historians, but were still writing about what was going on in Judea in the first century. They mentioned Jesus, and they mentioned also characters like Pilate and governors of the region and things that were happening in the region that also occur in the Gospels that match the evidence we have in the Gospels, who have no reason to accept Jesus if he was a fabrication. They have no reason to write about him as a historical figure if he was simply made up by Christians. They don't write about him as if that's the case. So I think that's a very good piece of evidence that we can point to. And simply the fact that, really, we don't have to go far for even in secular scholarship, even in historians who aren't Christians today, almost none of them will doubt or try to argue the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was likely a real man. That is almost universally accepted across the historical scholarship. So that would be a good place to go for that kind of evidence. I briefly started Googling and doing a little research on this, and I didn't write it down because I couldn't really find anything conclusive. There are some instances where there has even been archaeological hard evidence found of mentions of Jesus. One of them, and there's been some contention whether there was fabrication or whether there was some forgery going on. There have been tombs found that make reference to family members of Jesus. One of them there was a bone box that had an inscription that said it was James, the brother of Jesus. I didn't bring that up just because there is some question as to the authenticity of that. So I think the writers and the historians from the time is probably the safest bet to go with there. Okay, Jesus was a real person, but the resurrection is just a story. And specifically what I'm talking about here is it's legend, meaning it was made up well after the events. Much later down the road, we got the Bible and the Gospels, and they talk about the resurrection. But at the time Jesus was alive, he didn't actually raise from the dead. So that might be the next contention that you hear. If somebody's willing to accept that Jesus was a real person, okay, fine, but he didn't raise from the dead. That story was just made up by early Christians. What kind of argument or what kind of evidence from the things that we've talked about would you point to to counter this idea.
I just
You can mention his followers and how they put their life on the line for this Jesus who's resurrected from the dead.
Okay, we talked about that earlier, how, Christians who are willing to die for their beliefs, it is strong evidence not necessarily for the efficacy of the thing they believe, but it is evidence for how strongly they believe it. I think there's a point coming up where I'll jot that down later, but I don't want to put it under this point. I have something else in mind here. But just the notion that the story of the resurrection took a long time to be added to the Bible. How would we counter that point?
well, you did, a couple of class periods ago, you mentioned that if it was made up, it kind of goes along with what Chuck just said, if it was made up, why would they die for a lie?
Right. So, again, the fervency with which it was believed was that they were willing to die for it. It is very unlikely that someone will die for a knowing lie, something that they know is a fabrication. Now, have people died for lies? Yes, people can die for a lie, but they typically don't know that it's a lie when they're dying for it. If they're the ones who are creating the lie and perpetrating the lie, they would probably much rather live than try to keep the lie going. What I'm thinking about here is, go ahead, Brace.
The nearness of the New Testament documents. I mean, we have fragments of New Testament documents like the Gospel of John within the early portion of the 2nd century, when there would have been people who were still alive who have known the apostles and those who were teaching these things. So, and there are some, I think, early leaders of the church in the 2nd century who even write about their knowledge of the apostles and their experience with them and their accounts of the things that they heard in addition to the things that were written down and have been recorded. So.
Right. Yes, so the recentness with which the first writings and mentions of Jesus happen, and when we find them, are within the lifespan of people who would have been eyewitnesses to the events. So we went through kind of a whole timeline a couple weeks ago. If you recall, we started with writings that come prior to 200 AD that are almost universally across the board, pretty much verified and accepted by historians. And we walked it back year by year by year and showing that there's even earlier and even earlier and earlier mentions of the Gospels being legitimate, of the resurrection being believed as legitimate, going all the way back to 64 AD with some of the mentions of things that are corroborated in the Gospels by some of the writers there. And even earlier, the works of Paul are estimated to come around 54, 53 AD. That's only about 20 years separated from the resurrection itself. And people who would have seen the resurrection would have also seen the writings of Paul and could have matched up those two events. I wrote here, legends take time. In order for something to be created as a legend, as a story after the fact, you really have to be separated enough from the historical events that the falseness of the legend can't be disproven. If somebody makes up the story about the resurrection, and it's only 20 years after it happened, well, then all somebody has to do is say, no, that's not what happened because I was there too, and he died and he never came back. That's just a story that you're making up 20 years after the fact. It would be very easy to disprove. Go ahead, Brace.
Another thing, and it's not something I've been able to study, I'm not an expert in this, but there are people who study writing in ancient languages and compare the things that are written, the styles in which they're written, the names that are used, the different terms that are used to describe things, and can verify the authenticity of a document's age, at least as to when it claims to have been written, and the likelihood of it being written during that time period as opposed to, I mean, if I tried to write a document in 1st century Greek style, even if I knew Greek really well, I would be likely to make mistakes in grammar and other things that they wouldn't have made because of the fact that I don't speak that commonly. They use that language every day. They spoke in those ways. Idioms from various languages find their way into, I mean, it's, having the opportunity to preach in a foreign country, it becomes very difficult not to bring in some of our ways of speaking, and they look at you like, well, what does that mean? Because it doesn't translate to their language in the way that we would think it would. And so the literary style is appropriate for the time period in which it claims to have been written.
Right. And some of this depends on trusting scholars who know this much better than I do, because we read it in English, right? We're not reading it in the Aramaic or the Greek that it was written in. But the scholars do say that this literature, this writing, is coded to the time period that we would expect it to come from. It doesn't read like something that was made to sound older than it is. So Brace brings up a good point there. So the whole point of the legend coming much later is disproven by the recentness of the writings and the closeness with which they are tied to the events that they describe. Okay, so the next contention someone might make, and I think this is where we wanted to get to after a week ago, is that the resurrection didn't happen. The followers of Jesus faked the event to create a story to make people believe them. They were liars. So the resurrection was a hoax. And the thing that differentiates it from the previous point, here we're talking about it was a story that came much later. It got added to the Bible years and years later to make it sound more credible. This is the claim that right away the apostles made up the resurrection. They did something to fake it. They stole the body. You know, that's one of the biggest claims, is they stole the body. And so the Jewish leaders couldn't find the body of Jesus, and the apostles used that crime of stealing the body to make up the story about the resurrection. How do we counter this claim? That the disciples, the apostles, they were just liars.
Going back to what we said earlier about if they were lying about it, if they knew they were lying, they would not have been willing to die for that. So try to go back to what we said earlier. And then just a question I'm going to throw out there, which somebody could answer this. The claim that they stole the body, would that not have been extremely difficult given that the tomb was guarded in the first place?
I believe so. I would agree with that point, that the act of, again, who are the apostles? Who are they before? Stripping away all the nature of them being apostles or disciples of Christ, who are they? They're just poor fishermen and tax collectors, and they're just regular people. And an act of the Jewish people to essentially usurp the Roman guard, usurp the, whether they killed or incapacitated the guards to steal the body, is a pretty fantastical story. Now, one could argue, well, there were zealots among them. The zealots wanted to rise up. They wanted to overthrow the Roman occupiers. There were Jewish revolts that would happen in history prior to and after these events. But we don't see any historical record of those kind of events happening, where there was a Jewish revolt associated around the resurrection and the body of Christ. I wrote this is the point that Chuck and Samantha were making. Liars are rarely martyrs. Okay, people who are duped, people who are fooled, they might be martyrs. They might believe a lie and be willing to go to their deaths believing this lie. But the perpetrators of that lie know that they are lying. Go ahead, Jim.
The people, they took money to say that Jesus didn't raise the dead, that they come stolen away while we slept. There's no way that you can testify to anything while you're asleep. So what it boiled down to, they were hired, bribed liars, and we can see that from the scripture, and it's easy to believe that.
And another question I'm going to ask, Andrew, is would they not have been, wouldn't they have been killed as punishment for not doing their job? Or am I thinking something?
I think that's, I've heard that said fairly commonly, that if a Roman soldier failed in his duties or outright, rejected his duties, that the punishment would be death. I mean, soldiers today can be shot for insurrection and for treason. So that's kind of been a standing feature of soldiers throughout human history, is that you do your orders or else. So that's another point that can be made there. And to Jim's point, the Gospels even record the stolen body narrative, right? The Jewish leaders the soldiers come to the Jewish leaders later and they say, this happened, we got struck down, the body's gone, and the Jewish leaders pay them essentially hush money and say, tell them they tried to steal the body, tell them they stole the body. They from the very beginning created this other narrative. I don't know what I'm trying to say here. Cover up, I guess. And we have record of that in the Gospels. So it would be very hard. And the other thing, too, a lie gets harder and harder and harder to preserve the more people believe it and the more people try to say it, right? We've got 12 apostles who were his close confidants, who were his close companions, but there's, I think, far more disciples who would have to be implicated in this hoax for it to really make sense. I mean, you would have more of the disciples saying to the apostles, okay, so fine, you say he's resurrected, but how do you know? You're just telling us this story. The Gospels tell us that there were crowds, hosts of people who saw the resurrected Christ, not just the apostles, and that gave believability to those people. Dad, you had a hand up.
So to have a resurrection, you have to have a public death. And in the case of the crucifixion, I think the complicity of the Roman, the trials, the false courts, the false accusations, the public promenade where Jesus was walked to his point of crucifixion, it was done in such a way that any hoaxer could not have controlled those events.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the Roman government had every reason not to make a spectacle of Jesus, and yet it was all done very publicly and very much outside of any influence that the mere fishermen and tax collectors could have pressured the Romans to go along with their ruse.
I didn't mention before, but you reminded me of another point. I've seen other arguments made that they used a body double, that there was essentially someone died and then they got an actor to play Jesus after he rose from the dead. They got someone who looked like him and said, here's Jesus, he's back.
Who happened to have a hole in his side and a hole in his hands and his feet?
Well, exactly. The story from the very, very beginning, from the earliest Christian writings, talk about the nature of that body. He's not a healed body, he is a wounded body, but raised from the dead. That is a key difference there. And the second thing, the point that Dad made, is that Jesus' death was very undeniable and very public. So it would be very hard to pretend that somebody died who wasn't Jesus and then hide Jesus away and then bring him back out. That would be almost impossible due to the nature of Roman execution. Number one, it was 100% lethal. Roman execution did not have a very high failure rate because of the methods that they used. And the idea of having a body double stand in for Jesus, again, we kind of go back to some of the earlier points where that just wouldn't have flown with the number of people who would have had to believe it. There were enough people who were skeptics of the resurrection at the moment it happened. Even the apostles were skeptics of the resurrection. We have record of them saying, I won't believe it until I see it with my own eyes, and I touch the holes with my fingers. Dan?
Well, this isn't Jerusalem on your average Thursday or Friday or Saturday. This is Jerusalem during Passover weekend, which meant there were extra thousands, hundreds of thousands, extra millions of people in there. And then we, fast forward to the road to Emmaus, and it's kind of like, these two disciples, are asking Jesus, said, don't you know what's going on? I mean, this is not, you can't be in Jerusalem and not know this story. This is like Greg said, it's a very public, and it wasn't just the locals' story. This was extra. The whole city and the whole Jewish nation, regardless of where they were from multiple nations were there.
Right. Yeah. If Jesus' death was public, it was super public at the time when it happened, and especially among the Jewish audience who would have seen it happen. Okay, we'll go to the next statement here. We'll say, okay, the apostles weren't lying. They weren't liars, but they were mistaken. Something else happened to Jesus' body that they couldn't explain, and so they explained it by wishful thinking. They said he must have raised from the dead because we can't think of any other explanation. The argument I've seen here is that victims of crucifixion might have been thrown into a mass grave, and the dogs or the animals would have eaten the corpse, and so Jesus' body disappeared from this mass grave, and so then there was no, what am I trying to spell? Apostles. Okay, I can't talk and write at the same time. The body disappeared, and they couldn't explain it other than by saying he must have raised from the dead. Apostles. All right. Apostles were mistaken. Okay. These sound funny to us. These sound like, oh, that's ridiculous. That Jesus' body was eaten by dogs, and they came up with the resurrection to explain it. But these are real ideas that are floating around out there. Someone might say, well, could this have happened? What would we say to that? Go ahead, Brace.
People who are investigators and speak with witnesses would say that the consistency of their story, not the identical nature of the words that are used, but the consistency of their story would be difficult to conspire together to create. I think another thing that's really interesting about it is when we look at the gospel accounts, that was none of them were leaning toward the idea that Jesus was going to raise from the dead. They were all surprised by it. And the fact that became the story is interesting, considering it wasn't even something they considered plausible beforehand.
Right.
Or necessary even. And so all of that with regard to the consistency of it, it's pretty unlikely considering what they believed before and just the nature of people trying to retell something that is made up, whether a lie or otherwise, is hard to explain.
Yeah. The idea that, well, in Mark chapter 16, it's noted, this is repeated in other Gospels, but this is just the first one that I turned to that includes this idea. He was found first by the women who went to the grave, right? He was seen first by Mary Magdalene and the women who were with her. And it says that in verse 9 of Mark 16, when he arose on the first day of the week, he appeared first, speaking of Jesus, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept, but when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. After these things, he appeared in form to another 2 of them as they were walking in the country, and they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Afterward, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at table, and he rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. So the idea that they couldn't find the body and they came up with this resurrection story is not consistent with the mentality of the apostles themselves. They couldn't find the body, and they were dismayed that something's happened to the body, but they couldn't imagine that he had resurrected. Even when told that by the women, they didn't believe them. When told that by the other 2 who had seen him, they didn't believe them. The people who were saying made up the story were resistant to that hypothetical scenario or the hypothetical that he was eaten by dogs or stolen away or something. That was more likely in their minds than that he had raised from the dead. Go ahead, Andrew.
I was just thinking about the first 4 verses of how Luke opens up his account and how he took great pains to make sure that what he investigated was true.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that is a very important point, that there were eyewitnesses.
Right. The number of accounts that are consistent with the gospel record, really, it doesn't make sense here at this point, because this is taking a very hypothetical scenario. We don't know what else would have happened to the body, but it was something. It was some obscure thing that happened to the body. And to Brace's point, how then do you get from some obscure hypothetical where all of the eyewitnesses come up with the same series of events, how he raised from the dead the 3rd day, how he appeared, all of the details about Christ's resurrection are consistent, and you wouldn't expect that if they were scrambling for an explanation. It would be much messier than that. Okay, next point that someone might make, unless there was any other comments that I missed? Okay. Next, contention. So, someone might say, okay, eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection were somehow fooled. Actually, we already talked about this. Jesus either didn't die on the cross or an imposter was impersonating him. We already covered that one. The last one I want to talk about briefly, mostly because I'm just curious what we might say to this, because I didn't really prepare on this one. The witnesses to the resurrection were hysterical, or it was an event of mass insanity. There was some kind of mass hysteria or mass insanity that took over these people. They were hallucinating. They were dreaming. They all dreamed the same dream. Something happened where a bunch of people just went crazy and all thought that they saw this thing. First of all, is that, how far-fetched is that?
That's, well, being a psychology major, that's really far-fetched, because not everybody responds to the same situation the same way, and that's basically what this is saying.
Right? Right? I mean, I don't know psychology, and I wasn't a psychology major like Samantha, so I can say even less to this than others. I have heard it said that there can be environments and situations where a mass group of people or a somewhat large group of people can be made to think they believe something that they didn't see.
But they would have to be coached in order for that to happen, I think.
Okay, so the criteria for that happening is it's a very controlled
It
environment.
doesn't just, like, if Brace and I both thought we saw something, for example, and no one told us that, I highly doubt that. It's just very unlikely. I think in a situation like that, you would almost have to be told what you're seeing in order to believe that you're seeing something that you're not. I hope that makes sense.
I hope I spelled that right. I wrote that it's unlikely to happen organically. So basically, unless there was some very well-crafted conspiracy to fool people, it would be very unlikely that this event would just spontaneously happen and people would hallucinate or imagine this resurrection. Jesse?
Well, even if, and I use this in a lot of my groups, if you have, and this is a pretty good example of this too, I think. If you have an accident on a street corner and you have 6 people watching, you got 6 different accounts of the same thing, but they're gonna say something similar, but they're all gonna be different. And these are basically, they're saying the same thing. They're not, there's no difference.
So it wouldn't result in a consistent story. The other issue with that too is, the moment I'm picturing, I picture someone who makes this argument is likely talking about the time when Jesus appears to the 500 before he ascends into heaven, right? That's kind of the most, if you were picturing a hallucination, that might be the one that you picture. It always gets painted and people are like, oh, they have this look on their face like they can't believe what they're seeing. But that's not the only time Jesus appeared to people after he was raised, right? There were other events where he appeared in a room privately with his disciples. There were appearances where he walked along on the road and was talking with people independently of the rest of the disciples. So the number of appearances of Jesus, it's hard to, as hard as it would be to create a mass hysteria event once, this claim would have to assume that Jesus was able to create an event of mass hysteria at least a dozen times, and probably far more than we have recorded in the Gospels, and do it in such a way that all of their stories maintain consistency, even though he's appearing to different people in different situations and different contexts. I think just the idea that this was insanity, the idea that this was hallucination or hysteria, it's just another hypothetical. There's really, if they're thinking there's a lack of evidence for the resurrection, there's an even more ponderous lack of evidence for this kind of hypothetical. Any other thoughts or comments to close out this concept? Go ahead, Joy, and then Jesse.
Me?
Yeah.
So, because I have to simplify things, I think probably I would have to say, why don't you believe in Jesus, that he was real? I would put them on the defensive and have them list out their reasons, and then go. The next one would be, if a person doesn't want to believe, it won't matter how much evidence or arguments that come, they won't be convinced. And Thomas himself, I thought that was pretty interesting. It wasn't everybody, all of his disciples believed. Thomas did not believe, and he was a disciple of Jesus. It took convincing of him. So to me, if people can claim to be objective, it sounds like Thomas was being objective, and he even himself was convinced and shown improvement.
Right. I think that brings up a fair point to make, which I think the Gospels even acknowledge, that the resurrection is a fantastic event. And the resurrection is an event which, if you heard about it, would seem difficult to believe. It seems contrary to what these people knew. The apostles themselves said there's no way that's what happened. It's got to be something else. Someone stole his body. He's missing. We don't know where they've taken. That was their statement. We don't know where they've taken him. Was their immediate thought. And, Thomas believes, and Jesus said, blessed are you because you have seen and believed, acknowledging that it was hard enough to believe and needing to see in order to be convinced. That was a hard thing. But blessed are those who don't see and yet still believe. I think that's why God in his wisdom went through such lengths to make sure that the Gospels can establish the events as they happened are consistent. And the events as they happened match what we would see and read about if that thing had really happened. Rather than all of these counterpoints, if you ask what's the evidence for these counterpoints, it's mostly, well, it could have been this, it could have been that. What about this? What about that? They're potential alternatives, they're hypothetical alternatives, but none of them have the same level of consistency of evidence as the resurrection itself. Jesse, and then I saw Dad's hand.
Well, with as many conspiracy theorists we have out there, even in today's world, if they try to get a lie or they try to get a conspiracy of some sort going, the inconsistencies would be so broad and so blatant after a while that they wouldn't be able to keep up with it. You have one experiment that was done is they have a room full of people and they line them all up, and one starts with the story. And just within 3 people, it's already been changed. And by the time they get down to the end, they don't even have a concept of what they were talking about in the first place. And how could they even conceive that something like that was not going on here with their conspiracy theory?
Right. Yeah, the idea that you're talking about, if I'm understanding you right, it's, I've thought about this before. I love reading about conspiracy theories and how poorly constructed they are. And what you find is that they are so ad hoc, meaning every argument that they make, it's just for that one point that they're trying to make, but it doesn't match with the rest of the story. If you've ever read about people who talk about flat earth conspiracy theorists, they have a ton of ad hoc explanations. You say, well, how is it daytime in Paris and nighttime in Tokyo? And they say, well, because if the sun was overhead, it would light the whole earth, right? Well, they say, well, the sun is a spotlight. It shines on one spot at a time. Okay, well, that's your explanation for that, but that doesn't match the movement of the sun. That doesn't match the movement of the moon. It doesn't match all these other things. So an ad hoc explanation addresses one point. It doesn't address the summary of the points that are being made. So by saying, oh, dogs ate Jesus' body and the apostles just did what they could with that information, that's an ad hoc explanation for one point. Where did the body go? But it doesn't match the evidence for other things, like the fact that the chief priests anticipated a grave robbery, so they set up a guard. It doesn't match other details like we didn't even talk about this, the nature of Judaism and the treatment of bodies. Because it was around the Passover time, it would have been blasphemous for them to have a condemned criminal's body stay up over the weekend. So there's all these other details that one point, an ad hoc point, it doesn't address those, it addresses one. The resurrection addresses all. It's a summary addressing of those pieces of evidence, which makes it, I think, superior to these. I got to scramble for a what about, when I'm not really looking at the summary of evidence. Dad, and then I don't know if I saw another hand.
Luke 24 goes to a very interesting chain of events. You have the two visited on the road to Emmaus who returned to Jerusalem to tell what they've seen. And so while they're listening and they're marveling at their account, that's when Jesus appears in their midst. And rather than being hysterical and saying, oh, the risen Christ, they begin to say, well, there is a ghost in our midst.
Mm-hmm.
They actually jump to what I think is the more logical answer to what they experience when Jesus just kind of pops up right in the middle of them. They go, this isn't a man, this is a ghost. And then Jesus begins to talk with them and shows them his hands and his feet. In verse 40, verse 41. Now listen to this. For while they still could not believe it for joy and were marveling, he said, you got anything to eat? So here is their second wind. They're excited about what they're seeing. They're marveling at it. But they're still not going to the conclusion that this is the risen Savior. It is a process that we see going here that is totally antithetical to hysteria. They're reasoning this through. They're debating in their own minds. They're shocked. But they still just don't jump into a state of mass, oh, it's got to be, a risen person. We've never seen this before.
Right. Another point we didn't make is that hysterical people make for poor evangelists. They tend to have a hard time convincing more people to believe their hysteria when it's evident that something's happened to them, that they're hallucinating this event. People say, you're crazy. Go ahead, Dan.
I don't know if it makes a point or not, but it's just amazing how just a few years later, when Paul's teaching about what the importance of that resurrection was, as opposed to, they didn't understand the importance of that resurrection at that time. That was just the fantastical aspect of it was overwhelming to them.
At least some didn't. There was
Right.
Paul had to address issues of denying the resurrection. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's just there was nobody going, oh, that's what it said in Isaiah, or that's what Isaiah meant. They were they were overwhelmed by the event, not putting the true, if you want to call it doctrinal importance to the event. It was not, they were telling the story as it happened and how they reacted as opposed to, we had to witness this for it to be important for the rest of the, Christianity to be real.
Right. The early apostles, the early evangelists, their method of preaching wasn't, they showed up and they say, okay, everybody, let's turn to Luke chapter 24 and let's start, reviewing the text. They said, here's what I saw. Here's what I experienced when I was in Judea, when I was in Jerusalem, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whenever I was there. Here's what I saw. Then I saw him alive, and I saw him do these things. And then the Holy Spirit came upon us as a group, and here's all these signs and wonders that I can perform. Their preaching was a testimony. It was a telling of what they had seen. It wasn't just, let's turn to the text. Now, they were well versed in using the text. Paul was very good at saying, here's all the things I've seen, but also let's look at all the prophets and see, Jesus is the summary confirmation of all these things that have been written. Look in the scriptures and you'll see that it's so. They folded in all those other kinds of evidence and showed that it's consistent too with the thing that we experienced, and it's real. So it was a very real and tangible and visceral kind of preaching that they first experienced when they were getting people to believe the story. And the effectiveness that those apostles had is evident to their truthfulness and their veracity in the teaching of this. It wasn't just a depraved, raving, hysterical person trying to get people to believe what they had seen. People believed it because it was convincing and because it was true. Any other comments? We took a little longer on Lesson 4 than I anticipated, but I think it was good that we spent this time summarizing. We kind of been away from it for a week, so I thought that was a good summary of the last lesson. We're moving on to Lesson 5. We've got a few minutes here before the bell rings. We'll just kind of intro what we want to talk about in this lesson here. So I titled Lesson 5, What Makes Christianity Unique? And this is where we're going to start talking about why believe in the God of the Bible. This whole process in this class, we've been talking about, okay, why does it make sense to believe in some kind of God? Why does it make sense to believe in a God? Not necessarily the God of the Bible, but a God who could be the explanation for all the things that we see and experience. We talked about that. We started talking about Jesus Christ and his resurrection, and that is a strong piece of evidence for believing the God of the Bible. But I want to go a little further with that and start talking about Jesus as God. The thing that makes Christianity unique is that God came in the form of man to cleanse us of our sins. Other faith systems do not share this trait. This is something that is specific to the God of the Bible. So the intro to this lesson, I said the Gospels, they serve as a recent and historical account of the apostles' experience of being with Jesus. If we use the Gospels, and this is where we really start to shift our focus from just apologetic kind of teaching to really more evangelistic teaching. You'll find in having these conversations with people, you should really be blending the two. You don't want to just be treating apologetics like a history lesson or just treating it like a science lesson. The goal is to get to the point where we can start talking about why is Jesus special? Why is the Bible special? So, the question we want to think about is how do we prove from the Gospels that Jesus is deity, the thing that makes him unique? And I asked you to list some of the verses that you would use. And a parallel question to that we can also talk about is what kind of claims did Jesus make in his own words, and what kind of powers and authorities did he claim to have? So did anyone have a chance to think about that some and put down some ideas for where the Gospels specifically say that Jesus is God? Because it's a very popular movement, and I'm sorry to talk over folks if you were going to answer, Samantha.
No, I'm just thinking.
It's a very popular idea to say, yeah, Jesus was real, Jesus was a good man, Jesus was a good teacher. Some say, oh, he went on a pilgrimage to the Far East and he heard about Buddhism and then he took it back to Rome, and Christianity is just the Roman version of Buddhist faith, is what I've heard some people say. Don't know where they get the evidence for that. But how do we, from the Gospels, point to what Jesus is really saying about himself? Any passages folks wanted to throw out there? John?
Yeah, a lot of them are in John. I'm specifically thinking where he talks about, he and the Father are one. And also he made a comment that almost got him stoned was, before Abraham was, I am.
Yes. So those are some two very key ones. That's John chapter 14 is where Jesus is talking about his closeness with the Father and his being one with the Father. Specifically there in verses 6 through 10. He says, Jesus said to them, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on you do know him and have seen him. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us. Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, or else believe on account of the works themselves. So here at least Jesus says a couple of things. One, he says, I am the only way to the Father. We'll talk about that more on Wednesday, that notion of Christianity being the only path to God. And he also talks about oneness with the Father there. Now you could say, well, he could be a man and be possessed by the Father. Maybe that's what he's saying here. We'll look at some more verses here in the coming weeks. So this is your homework for Wednesday. I want you to come up with passages from the Gospels where either something is said about Jesus, where he is God, not just claiming that he's a prophet sent by God or that he's a teacher who knows God, that Jesus is God. How would you prove that from the Gospels? And how would you prove that from the words that Jesus says about himself? And we'll start on that on Wednesday. Thank you all for your attention this morning.